Hey, it's Savannah again. If you've been around a while, you will know that we already have 2 videos on our channel of this cosplay for the shirt and the pants. But today I'm finally finishing the Captain Flint series with the construction of the coat. This cosplay was for a client, so I did create a pretty in-depth mock-up for him to try on. This is that mock-up. I did end up having to make a few changes, but once I got the mock-up to where I finally liked it, I then tore it apart and used it as a pattern to cut out my fabric. The main fashion fabric for this coat was a flax linen from Lithuania. It had a geometric pattern woven into it, and it was a dark gray that I then dyed darker. The lining was just a finer style linen from a local Etsy shop. Both fabrics were quite frayy, so I started out by serging all of the edges to keep the pieces intact throughout the whole build. I started by placing the trim on the coat front pieces. This trim was the closest I could find for this part of the cosplay. It was a 1/2-inch rickrack trim made of real leather from an Etsy shop called Leather Stripper. I hand sewed this trim to keep the stitch visibility to a minimum. Then I started working on the pocket flaps because I needed to know their size in order to set up the rest of the front of the coat. I used leftovers of the shirt fabric and dyed the scraps different variations of browns, maroons, and one yellow one. I patched these over the pocket flaps according to what I could see on the show. They aren't exact, but they are close enough to read accurately. I then hand sewed these down as well. Here you will see me prepping each patch so that I can hand sew it onto the pocket flap. Once I had all of the patches pinned into position, I quickly went around the pocket flap border with just a large basting stitch so that I could cut all the patches flush with the edge of the pocket flap. As a finishing touch, each one of the flaps had a long strip of the striped fabric around the outsides of the flap. To save time, I ended up doing the cuffs of the coat at the same time to batch my work. Once again, I couldn't see exactly how this was set up on the screen-worn costume, so I tried my best to make it read as Captain Flint's coat does, but it's not screen accurate. I then covered the pocket flaps and cuffs with a wash of black acrylic paint and water. This was to weather them and help them blend into the coat a little bit more. I did this in layers. The water darkened the fabric when applying it, so I had to wait for it to dry and reapply if it wasn't dark enough. And here are all the pocket flaps and the cuffs nicely weathered. So I'm working on the pocket flaps and pockets for the Captain Flint cosplay. Basically, the pants don't have any pockets, and obviously the shirt wouldn't have pockets, so we wanted to actually put some pockets into this to make it functional for events and stuff. So I'm just going to do a very simple welt pocket using this same fabric to make just a singular flap, because your hand's going to go in this way, so it's going to be opening facing that way. Just on this first bit, it's going to be a little bit low on the coat compared to what most pockets are inside of pants or inside of your own coat, but I didn't want to compromise the actual look of it, so a pocket, even if it's lower, is better than no pocket at this point. After constructing the pocket, I was finally able to start spacing out the rest of the leather trim on the front of the coat. I waited to sew the flaps on so that I wouldn't have extra things for my thread to get caught on while I was hand sewing all the trims. I call these loops of trim little hourglasses since they kind of look like hourglasses laying on their side. There are 12 on each side of the front of the coat, 6 on each pocket flap, and 9 on each of the cuffs. And then on the back, there's 7 each on either side of the back gore. This was a lot of tough hand sewing. I actually ended up using some patches of duct tape on my fingers just to help protect them from the back of the needle, because I used the back of my thumb and my forefinger to help push the needle through the fabric. I then started building the back of the coat. I sewed up the back seam and then cut out 3 diamond-shaped patches from some of the coat fabric I hadn't yet dyed. These are set above each split in the skirt of the coat. I didn't attach them right away though. I first needed to figure out the rest of the trim. I then started working on the gores. I thought that the gores were solid, but after watching the show again, I realized that there was definitely a split in the center back at the very least. So I ended up having to go back and put a split in retrospectively, which meant tearing this one back out. In frustration, I ended up setting this back to the side for a second and starting work on the back trims instead. On the center back gore, there's actually a piece of trim that's made out of the shirt fabric once again. There's also another leather trim with little triangles cut out of it. You can see a little bit here in this screenshot. I couldn't find anything like it online, so I made the triangle trim myself by cutting the little triangles out of a rectangular trim. I added the shirt trim first since the triangular trim needed to be on top of all the other layers of trim. Now it was time to get back to work on the gores again. To add the split, I first started by finding the center of the fashion fabric piece and the lining piece. After marking the center, which was also the new slash line, I pinned these pieces with right sides together. I then stitched around the hem and up and around the slash line, leaving space at the top so that the entire gore was still one piece. I then removed the pins and carefully slashed the split in the gore. I also clipped the seam allowances to help with the turnout. I then turned the gore right side out, helped poke out the corners of each of the split, and then gave it a good pressing. I then secured the outer edges of the gore with some pins and went ahead and did a large basting stitch around both edges. I then reset this gore back into the skirt of the coat. I did end up adding splits to both the side gores as well. Once the gores were finally put in place, I then added the diamond-shaped patches above each split in the skirt of the coat. I just loosely basted these down with a whip stitch since the trims were also going to help secure them as well. Before spacing out the next set of trims, I first carefully folded and pressed each gore into the position it was going to live in. Now it was finally time to add the triangle trim. This trim went all the way along the bottom of the coat and around each gore. I also had to be careful at the bottom to make sure to place the trim with the space for the 5/8 inch hem. Here's a shot of the back of the coat with all the trim ready to be hand sewed down. This set of trim was a little bit easier to hand sew through just because it was a faux leather and not a real leather. Before adding the lining, it was finally time to add in the 4 pocket flaps. After sewing them on, I gave them a good press and pinned them into place to add the buttons. For the front pocket flap, only the top and the bottom button are actually attached all the way through the pocket flap and through the front of the coat. The rest are only attached to the flap so that you can get your hand in and out of the pocket. The second pocket flap was fully attached to the coat. Here are the pocket flaps fully finished. You can also see that I put some of the 1/2-inch rickrack trim around the outside of the pocket flaps. I then finished the back of the coat by putting the rest of the hourglasses onto the back gore. Here's a nice little shot of all of the trims and buttons being finished on the skirt of the coat. It was now time to work on the buttons for the front of the coat. The ones I found were a very bright silver and they needed to be darker, so I also weathered these with the black acrylic paint. I then proceeded to sew on all 24 of the front buttons. Here's a shot of the main body of the coat finally being finished. Sleeve construction was next. I first sewed up the main body of the sleeves. I then constructed the cuffs. I didn't want the buttons to be sewed through the lining of the cuffs, mainly because these weren't actually buttons. I couldn't find any extra large dome buttons that match, so I bought these dome rivets instead. I ended up having to wire these on because without an actual dome press, I couldn't get the rivet parts to set without making massive dents in them. This wasn't a load-bearing button, so the wire was fine. I used an awl to make the holes and then threaded the wire through these holes. I then twisted the wire and set the points back into the rivets to keep them from catching on anything. I then attached the lining to the cuff once the rivets were all added. The 1/2-inch rickrack trim was also added to the outside edge of these cuffs as well, just like the pocket flaps. I then added the cuffs onto the sleeve using a 5/8" seam allowance. I then whip stitched down the seam allowances at the wrist because this is where I will later whip stitch the sleeve lining in. I proceeded to then make up the coat lining just like the outer shell of the coat. The only difference is that I pre-pressed the seam edges of the gores down before sewing the lining and the coat shell together. Pinning the right sides together of the lining and the coat shell, I then sewed around the entire perimeter. I clipped all the seam allowances and then turned the coat right side out through one of the gore openings. I pressed the edges of the coat before I then carefully pinned and slip stitched the gore openings. To finish the coat lining, I then whip stitched the wrists of the sleeves together. As one last final detail, I needed to add one of the large rivets to the bottom of the diamond shapes on each side gore of the coat. And with that, the coat was finally finished. This coat took 92 hours to complete. The whole outfit was deceptively detailed. It used about 60 yards of various trims, 91 buttons, 13 different bottles and packets of different dyes, and a little over 10 yards of fabric for all of the outfit together. To this day, this is still one of the cosplays that I am most proud of. I'm also really happy to finally have this series finished. It only took me 5 years, but hey, for those who come after, you get to binge watch it. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you'll take some time to check out some of our other videos.